Hello, fellow educators. Welcome to the Classroom Behaviour Solutions podcast, the podcast that gives you weekly scientifically grounded and evidence-based solutions to your behaviour dilemmas, providing a blueprint to developing flexible behaviour solutions that really work for your individual pupils, classes, or even whole school environments. If you're a teacher, a Senko, or even a school leader with a passion for supporting pupil behaviour in a way that is positive and effective, this podcast is for you. My name is Adam Dean, and I'm your host. This week, I'm incredibly excited to welcome Matt Cicoria, host of the Behaviour Observations podcast, a podcast I've been listening to since 2018 when I did my training, and also founder of Positive Behaviour Outcomes, LLC.
Yep.
And our first fellow BCBA and ABA professional on the show. Hello, Matt. Welcome.
Hey, Adam. Thanks for having me on. I'm really excited to chat with you.
Thank you very much. Did I get all of that right? Was that?
Yeah, it's pretty. Yeah, it's great.
And I should say, because there's a lot of listeners that aren't ABA professionals themselves, and this is sort of about introducing people to the concepts, that Matt's podcast interviews, I'd say, all of the big boys in ABA at the moment. So there's a few names that I won't name here because a lot of people listening won't know who they are because they're not ABA professionals, but they're really exciting people. So it's really exciting to talk to you, Matt.
Thank you. As I like to say, I've got like the best job in behavior analysis. I get to have all these conversations with exciting leaders in the field doing cool stuff, in addition to my own kind of clinical work. So yeah, I'm really grateful to have stumbled across the podcasting medium. And I'm also grateful for other people like yourself who are taking this up and having more voices out there, because I am a huge fan of the podcasting medium in general. And, just interacting with listeners over the years, they've remarked on how helpful that shows like mine and others have been in terms of their learning about the field and things along those lines. So yeah. I've got I'm a really lucky guy, I guess, to have wandered into this world of podcasting.
When did you start? Because I was looking through it looked like you started with a blog in 2016 and then moved to podcasting.
Is that
right?
That's very sharp of you. I guess I'll roll it back a little further than that, but I would say that, so I've been a behavior analyst behavior analysis is a young field. So for folks who aren't familiar with behavior analysis, it's relative to things like psychotherapy and social work and speech pathology, et cetera, of the so-called helping fields. Behavior analysis is quite young. And I've been a behavior analyst. I've been practicing since 1999. I got my first exposure to it a few years earlier than that when I was an undergraduate. But I got out of graduate school in 1999, went to work with individuals with severe developmental disabilities in a residential setting, severe aggression, severe self-injurious behavior, pica, all sorts of stuff like that. And then for the last, 15 or 16 years, I've been consulting to schools in the Northeast of the United States. And so I've been at this, long story short, I've been at this for a long time. And so about, close to like maybe 8 or 10 years ago, I was seeing a need to do some sort of, outreach work or dissemination or something like that. And what I was noticing at the time is that I was consulting to schools all across New Hampshire, Vermont, and Massachusetts. And there were a lot of people who were interested in behavior analysis. They were taking workshops in it and things like that, but there were still lots of teachers who didn't really know much about it. And so I was like, I should do a podcast, and I should get involved in some sort of new media. And I didn't really know what form it would take, so I was looking at blogs for the most part, because that was, that was in the heyday of blogging. I thought maybe a YouTube channel might be helpful or something like that. And what I realized very quickly is blogging, if you're going to do it really well, is extraordinarily time consuming and difficult, because it's essentially like writing a term paper for a graduate course, like
Yeah.
every week. It's like, man, this is like another job, and not that podcasting isn't. And then I thought about, okay, well, maybe a YouTube channel would be helpful, and then I realized how much effort it takes to edit video. I mean, all the barrier, all these things are easier now because the tools I think are more readily available, and there's been a lot of innovation to help creators make content more easily. But I kind of discovered the podcasting medium almost by accident. I started listening to all these shows, and I was like, you know what? Maybe what I could do is start a podcast, and instead of me, reinventing the wheel every week, talking about a different topic to research and write up and present, I can just talk to other people who are experts in the field, who are already up to speed on the latest and greatest stuff in that very niche that they're living and breathing, and I can have them come on the show. So it was kind of like almost like I don't want to say a lazy man's way out, but it just seemed to me that would be a better audience experience. And I also am just, again, very much a fan of the medium itself. So having a podcast was a cool idea at the time. I also I have a very good friend of mine who, if it wasn't for his encouragement, I wouldn't have done it. Also, I have a good friend of mine who's he's a programmer and coder and stuff like that. And he loves everything techie. He's just one of those guys. I'm not naturally a tech-oriented person, but when I started throwing around the idea of doing a podcast, he wouldn't let me let it go. It was really, and so he helped me with all sorts of stuff. He helped me put my website together over at Behaviour Observations. He showed me how to use GarageBand. All sorts of things. We set up the email list. So we spent probably a month or two putting everything together. And so that was all in about 2015. And sometime during 2015, I started reaching out to people to record shows. And just to give you a sense of where the podcasting world was at the time, at the time when I was reaching out to people, I would say, hey, my name is Matt Cicoria. I'm a behavior analyst. I live in New England, and I am starting this thing. It's called a podcast. It's kind of like an internet radio show, right? So in other words, I had to explain to people what a podcast was, because it wasn't really a household term at the time. So I recorded a bunch of shows in 2015 and launched the podcast itself in February of 2016. And I've been, putting out anywhere from 2 to 4 shows a month since. I just put out episode 212 yesterday, and it's been great. Have almost 4 million downloads since the start.
That's incredible.
It's downloaded in well over 100 countries. It's blown my mind how much it took off. It took off beyond my wildest dreams, Adam. So it's just been one of those things where, again, I just I don't, it's really hard to put into words.
There's something quite sad. I mean, I'm at about 280 downloads at the moment, so I've got a little way to go. But there's something quite satisfying about refreshing that page and seeing how many people, and also seeing where it's being downloaded across the world. I've really enjoyed that. Like you see one in China or one over here. It's quite a few in the States, and it's really exciting. So I can imagine that times a million would be incredible.
It's incredible. Yeah, it's incredible. Yeah.
It's really exciting to hear you say that you started yours to try and spread that sort of the concept of behavior analysis to sort of that wider audience, because that's the idea here as well. Because I think ABA is still it's present in the UK, but I don't think it's as present as it is in the US. I think it's more focused in on mainly sort of independent schools or private schools, and specifically around pupils with quite significant level of needs. We're starting to see it more in sort of care homes and the care industry, usually under positive behavior support. Seeing a few adverts going out there for PBS practitioners and BCBAs now, but you don't really see the science in what we call a mainstream classroom. So we've typically developing children and children that are learning the national curriculum. It's not really there. You see the tools, things like token economies, and you see ABC sheets all over the place, but not that sort of scientific background. So I suppose my first question for you is, what do you think would be the most useful concepts that those types of practitioners that don't have access to ABA support or BCBAs would be good for them to learn about?
So I guess the answer would depend on where the people are practicing. So and what their role is. If you're an elementary school teacher, or I don't know if you'd say primary school in the
primary,
I told you I was going to work in some things. So I should say firstly, Adam, and I'll also, just before I get into the answer, I'll also just clarify here. ABA is not necessarily mainstream in American classrooms, I'll call regular education classrooms. The extent to which ABA is standard of care here in the States is for it's a healthcare service primarily, and that's changed over the last several years because now insurance covers medical health insurance covers ABA treatment generally for individuals with autism, depending on how impacted they are with what their severity level is. And so many ABA practitioners in the U.S. work for private agencies that provide ABA as a healthcare service. And that's again, and being around the field for a long time, that's new. Now ABA is also practiced in some school settings. So for example, if a school district decides to put together a program to support students with autism or those types of similar disabilities, they will often either have a behavior analyst consulting to their program, or they'll if they're lucky enough to hire their own behavior analyst, there's that. But that's about, and some schools might have a behavior analyst working on working to support individuals who don't have autism but have other types of emotional behavioral challenges, ADHD, oppositional defiant disorder, all the kind of alphabet soup type of diagnoses. And so because of that, but from an instructional perspective, there's not a lot of ABA focused behavior analytic interventions in regular education, i.e. non-disabled classrooms. Now, so I feel like I just put this like kind of giant qualification on my answer here. So having said all that, I would say that if there is an elementary school teacher, one of the things I would have them focus on is with each student is not just looking at the student's accuracy on a particular skill, but also accuracy in combination with speed, or what we call fluency. And that's something that we don't, I think we pay less and less attention to. One example, a huge soapbox issue of mine is kids not learning their math facts the way that they historically have. I have friends. My wife's a high school English teacher. We've got friends who are math teachers, and so on and so forth. And this is completely anecdotal, so I'll say that. I would love to be proven wrong, Adam. So if someone has data out there to suggest otherwise, I would love to see it. But anecdotally, what we're seeing is fewer students who have command of their math facts and have to count on their fingers. And I'm talking like middle school and high school students, college students. And if you think of what is involved with larger operations, like long division, algebra, you can go on and on and on.
Yeah.
If you have to stop to count on your fingers, if you have to stop to reference a multiplication chart,
Yeah, that's very true.
et cetera, what is that going to do? That's going to make all those calculations much more exponentially more difficult. And if we're concerned about problem behavior, if you've got a student who's in the 5th grade and they're kind of on the bubble, they could go either way, in terms of problem behavior, disruptive behavior in the classroom. They don't know their math facts and they start doing some complex operation, and that complex mathematical calculation is way more harder than it needs to be because the kid is referencing a multiplication chart, or they're counting on their fingers, or what have you, even using a calculator. It just adds a step. What we're going to do is motivate problem behavior that's going to be reinforced by escape from that particular task that is more arduous than it needs to be. So I would say for folks in regular education, focusing on so I guess to bring it back to accuracy versus fluency is so if that student is allowed unlimited time to demonstrate math facts accuracy, and they're counting on their fingers and toes and all that stuff, they are correct. I'm using air quotes here. This is a podcast. They're quote unquote correct, but they don't have the skill at the level of fluency that is required to progress beyond that, and they're setting themselves up for frustration down the road, which could further and further, I guess, cleave them from the kind of traditional academic setting. They're going to get further and further behind, and those things kind of snowball. And the interaction, there's some data out there that suggests that if you don't read and do math well by the 1st or 2nd grade, the likelihood of you having some sort of diagnosable condition like ODD or ADHD is high. Now that's correlational, is it? Not necessarily causational. So I'll put that out there as well. It could be that if you have ADHD and you're not, you're having a hard time paying attention, sitting still and whatnot, you're going to lag those skills. That could go either way, of course. But I think so we could put the causation part aside for a moment and just say, the lacking of those skills can make things much more difficult. Another example is knowing things like your letter sounds to a certain level of fluency, or other components of the composite skill of reading. So it's always good. It's always a good idea to kind of know what the ingredients are to the more complex skill that you're trying to teach. So, and I'm not a reading. I'm not. I'm going to tiptoe up to the point of talking beyond my area of expertise, or talking at my rear end, I guess. And what I'll say is that if you consider reading a complex skill that's made up of several smaller components, like you need to know what the letters are, you need to know what the letter sounds are. You need to know, the various blends. You need to know the CAC word, blah, 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 blah. You can go through all the scope and sequence of what constitutes reading. And the same principle applies. Does a student know their letters? Can they recognize their letters, not just accurately, but fluently at a certain level of acceptable speed, such that they don't have to think about it? Same thing with letter sounds. This is an anecdote, but I have a friend of mine who does a lot of tutoring from a precision teaching, and I'm using precision teaching kind of almost interchangeably with behavior analysis because it's from the school of behavior analysis. But he's a precision teacher, and he does a lot of coaching and tutoring of kids who are struggling readers. And he was working with like a 6th or 7th grade kid, and just was having a terrible time reading. And they went back and they actually did an analysis, and they found out that his letter sounds, stuff that you learned several years upstream from where he was as a student. He knew them, but he was very disfluent with them. It took him a long time. And what they did is they hammered those letter sounds in such a way that he now knew them. He knew them cold. He knew them quickly. He knew them at a certain acceptable level of fluency. And everything downstream from that became much more easier to do. He became a more fluent reader. The composite skill of reading was much improved because they went back and corrected this one thing that was kind of holding him back, much in the same way that not knowing your math facts is going to hold you back from algebra and all sorts of other things. So I would say as a classroom teacher, those are two educational interventions or educational concepts that I would pay more attention to. Excuse me.
I really like that, because I sort of, when we started this conversation and I asked that question, I thought, we're probably going to talk about reinforcement or contingencies, and I've done a couple. No, but what you've said is so much more interesting, because I mean I've talked a couple of times on the podcast about escape maintained behavior and sort of the effective behavioral effort. But I've never considered the impact of not learning those foundational skills on a task. So when I've talked about, say, escaping from a maths task, in my head it's always been the maths task is too difficult, or there's too many steps, or you've not given them enough support. But actually, sometimes it's about making sure they're fluent in all the stuff that they need to do before they get to that task. Absolutely. In the same way, if we're sorry, go on, Matt.
Yeah. So I on my Instagram page, for folks who want to check it out, it's at Behavioral Observations. And I'm sorry, guys, I don't put the U in behavior. I don't know why the States is the only place that does that, but anyway, that's perhaps a conversation for a different day. But anyway, I'm trying to look for it right now. But I'll look for it later. I'll send it to you so you can put it in the show notes. But there was actually a really elegant study that was done by a couple friends of mine, Carrie Milico and Claire St. Peter and a few others. And what they did is they compared a traditional behavioral intervention for a student versus the student. I think there were two students. They were acting out in math class. And I think they're elementary level students, and it was particularly during a certain activity. I think they were trying to do skip counting or whatever, and they would always have problems during anything that having to do with skip counting or other types of kind of counting practice and whatnot. And it turned out that they compared a functional communication training type of intervention. In other words, the kid could say pause or break or something like that, and they would get a break from the task. In other words, they determined through a functional assessment that the kids were acting out to get out of this task. And so they compared teaching the kid to ask for escape appropriately versus really doing structured fluency practice for that activity in which they were always having trouble in, behavioral troubles. That is, and what they found out is that both interventions were successful at reducing problem behavior, but with the functional communication training, they never actually mastered the skip counting. They didn't do any work. Whereas the precision teaching approach, if you will, or what they refer to it as frequency building approach, meaning that you get faster and faster at doing it. That had the same benefit of basically eliminating problem behavior, because they presumably did the teaching in a very fun. There's a lot of fun and ways to do it that doesn't really that's not necessarily stressful for the individual, and they actually mastered the skill So it's like it was like they
Yeah.
got the best of both worlds out of it. So sometimes behavior analysts, we can be too clever by half, and put these fancy reinforcement interventions in place, but it doesn't solve the root of the problem in terms of the academic skill deficits. So so that is it's a very elegant study. I'll email it to you so you can
That would be
include it.
amazing.
Yeah, really, really fun. But beyond that, yeah, you're absolutely right. Though there are tons of classroom management strategies out there, and there's a lot of easy ones that don't require the individual. There's like a lot of classroom based ones that don't require individual interventions and things like that. And I can certainly get into those if you want, or some other questions you want to get to. That's fine too.
Well, that would be. I've got to say though, before, like, because I've worked primarily with pupils that are very significantly affected by their autism for a long time. I used to do outreach, but when I did my training, I will always remember, because I did a master's in autism, and then I did a conversion course through Florida Tech.
Okay.
So I remember very clearly Jose Martinez talking a lot about the potential for sort of using the techniques of ABA in mainstream schools and precision teaching and stuff like that. So it's exciting to have that sort of come back up in my mind again, because it's not something I've talked about or heard about for a long time. But yeah, in terms of sort of those sort of whole class techniques, or I suppose over here, a lot of those mainstream classrooms do have children with additional needs, ADHD and autism and things like that. What do you think are some of the most accessible ways to support functional behavior in a classroom?
Yeah, so if I'm a second or third grade teacher, any kind of grade teacher, I'm going to look at things in terms of almost like a funnel, if you will. And at the top of that funnel are going to be things like, what's the structure of the classroom? How is it laid out? What are the routines? Are those routines clear? Are the expectations for the routines actively taught and reinforced? And then going further down from that, you'd look at specific type of classroom behavior games or strategies. And I've got a couple of go-tos that I like to use that I'll talk about in just a second. And then further, as that funnel kind of narrows towards the bottom, and that's when you get into like, okay, we've done all the, it's almost like the upside down PBIS pyramid, I guess. I think of it a different way. But as you go towards the point, whether you're going up or down, you're going toward from a more general to a more individualized type of intervention. So at the widest point of the funnel or the pyramid, depending on your perspective, your perspective, again, one of the things I like when I'm sitting in a classroom, this has happened countless times, Adam, where I've been asked to do a functional behavioral assessment on a particular child, and I'll go to observe the classroom. And the classroom, there's really not a sense of order in the classroom. There's the students are kind of doing their own thing. The teacher tries to transition the kids from like the carpet to their desks or or to line up or whatever. Maybe some kids do and some kids don't. The teacher moves on before the entire class, follows the directive. So you have some kids kind of lingering over here while everyone else is over there, that sort of thing. And so there's been many times when I've been in those classrooms, I'll go back to the whether it's the principal or the special ed coordinator, whoever basically tasks me to that classroom. I'll say, look, maybe that student does need a functional assessment, but we've got bigger fish to fry here, because there are a lot of students engaging in either off task or maybe outright problem behavior. And we need to do some things in this classroom before we can even think about implementing some sort of individualized intervention. And honestly, if the teacher is not currently doing those kind of global things, they're not going to be able to pull off an individualized intervention, so the things I'll look again. So what I'll do is I'll look at, okay, let's write down all the routines, throughout the day or throughout the period. If it's a secondary setting where, kids are moving from one teacher to the next, a couple or several times a day. So you want to get the flow of what the expectations are across the day. And then just start practicing those things. This is how we line up. And a lot of teachers do a great job of this within like the first couple of days of school. And then they move on. And oftentimes, and they don't move on based off of fluent performance. They move on because they're under pressure to get into the curriculum. So, so if I sound like I'm making fun of or belittling teachers, I'm not. Like I said, my wife's a teacher. Teachers under enormous strain to get performance gains out of their students. They've got they're getting pulled in so many different directions, and so they are under, again, a lot of pressure to proceed with the curriculum, to the point of which when I say, hey, you know what, let's spend 15, 20 minutes a day practicing and reinforcing these routines, they look at me like I've asked them to split an atom, because they're like, oh my God, Matt, I have, these kids are behind in reading, and the principal is blah, 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 and the school district, and and my response is usually something like, you're absolutely right. You are under a lot of pressure. And if these kids become more efficient at getting from point A to point B, if you're not having to stop class and stop instruction every 5 minutes to put this fire out and to put that fire out, think of how much more work you could be done. And I've actually gone to principals to go to bat for these teachers and said, look, I know you're everyone's, there's a lot of high stakes education, kind of things happening here in the United States, for better or worse, and all that's kind of outside of everyone's immediate control. But the idea is that, I'll go to the principal and said, look, we really need to spend time kind of getting this classroom back under control. And in doing so, we'll be able to really turbocharge our gains down the road, because the teacher will have the temporal space in which to instruct effectively. And usually when I lay it out like that, I get a lot of cooperation. I haven't really had people say, "Oh, we can't do that," So practicing those routines, rewarding those routines. There's a paper I actually found yesterday that I can't cite the authors off the top of my head, but I'll send it to you. But it was a really, it was an intervention where they basically made a game out of lining up, or made a game out of transitioning camera. It was like beat the clock type of thing, and so they had like a minor reward associated with it. And if the kids move from point A to point B under a certain amount of time, not recklessly so, but orderly, but also quickly, they earn tokens that accumulated to a reward of some sort or another. Really, simple stuff. But basically the idea is, just because you tell a group of second graders that it's the right thing to do to move from point A to point B, some of them may cooperate with that, and some of them may, but you're not going to reason in an entire group into doing that successfully. And so, yeah, so there's that. And then from another thing I would encourage folks to think about is that if you're a teacher, or if you're observing a teacher, think about how many opportunities students have to respond in a given span of time. And one of the things, and also, like, if a teacher asks a question during a lesson, is that question being answered by one student? And if so, I would recommend kind of changing it up a little bit. There's a lot of research that suggests when you ask a question to the whole class and have them respond in unison, and that can be done in a couple different ways. That not only gets you less problem behavior, but it also engages the entire class. And there's I think we need more research in this area, but I think there's some research suggests that it gets better, better Academic outcomes.
Mm.
So let's talk about some examples of that. So, what is the, so if the teacher says, what is the capital of Massachusetts? And she says that out to the class, and under like the quote unquote traditional way of instruction, maybe one student will raise their hand, or maybe a handful of students raise their hand, right? The teacher calls on one child. The student says, they either say Boston, which is the capital of Massachusetts, or they'll say something else. And so the teacher will either praise the correct response or maybe move on to another student if the student gets it wrong, or correct it, or some sort of. And so we're supposed to, this mythology in education is such that we just kind of assume that the rest of the students are watching, are paying attention, are listening, and learning by osmosis, by dint of being in the same room, as this interaction is only occurring between two people. When you say it like that, it sounds actually kind of weird.
Yeah,
right?
yeah, it really does.
At least that's my take on it. Whereas if you have a teacher say, what's the capital of Massachusetts, and then cues the class by saying everybody, and everyone says, shouts out Boston, that's going to do a couple of things. That's going to engage the entire class in that learning unit, if you will, of the question, the answer, and the feedback from the teacher. If you say Philadelphia, which is the incorrect answer, if you say some other town in Massachusetts, or whatever, you're instantly going to be corrected, because most of the class is going to be saying the correct response, right? So and then from a problem behavior perspective, there's really, if you're going to engage in problem behavior, you're not going to get much of an audience under those circumstances, because everyone is shouting out the same answer. So doing whole class responding is really something I encourage teachers to take advantage of. It's free. Doesn't cost you anything more. And you can combine the two. You could say, hey, everybody, what's the, what's the capital of such and such, and one student could raise their hand, and she could say, Johnny, that's correct. Everybody, so you see that cue, everybody, and then that cues the entire class to respond in unison. So you can combine those two, but the single student responding really isn't necessary. Another thing is combining that whole class responding with a high rate of asking questions, or what are referred to as opportunities to respond. So if a student goes for a long time, several minutes, between being asked to give any type of active learning response, that's wasted time. So if the teacher can go through lots of questions in a short period of time, using that kind of unison whole class responding, it's going to lead to fewer problem behaviors and much better educational outcomes for that student. So again, to get it back to where I started this kind of rant, I suppose, is that if you're observing a classroom, try to look how many opportunities to respond a particular student has. And they might go a half hour without having to give any type of active response. I mean, it really is remarkable in some circumstances how little responding students are asked to actively, emit, and the responding doesn't have to be vocal either. That's the easiest one to pull off, because everyone has, unless you have some sort of, developmental issue, everyone has access to their voice. Another thing you could do is thumbs up or thumbs down for yes/no questions. There are like whiteboards, or response cards. The literature regarding this topic is there's decades and decades of research. So so I would definitely that would be the next thing on the checklist. So you got your classroom routines and structure. You've got your, to what extent students are responding. What are the opportunities to respond? Is the responding choral in nature, or whole group in nature, or single student responding? Excuse me. And if you're still seeing behavior problems at that point, there's a really neat intervention called the good behavior game. I don't know. I see you nodding your head, so you sound like you're familiar with that.
I've come across the good behavior game. It's been a little while since I've used it, but I've definitely come across it. Yeah.
So the good behavior game is it's got obviously a silly title to it, but it is a group contingency, basically. And I'll explain what that means in just a second. But basically what it does is it provides students rewards based off of low rates of problem behavior, and it works in the following way. So what you would do if you're a teacher is you play it for a short period of time, maybe like 10 or 15 minutes, or maybe during like a lesson at the whiteboard or the easel or what have you. And you say, hey, okay, for the next, while I'm up here at the board, or while I'm here, at carpet time, we're here at circle time, we're going to play the good behavior game. And what you do is you divide the class into two groups. And the idea is that you tell the groups, okay, if you talk out, or if there's other disruptive behavior, your whole team gets a point. So you have team A and team B. And when someone blurts out, you get a point. And the teacher has like a little T-chart on the board or the easel where they can keep score. And then they go ahead and teach the lesson. And if someone blurts out, they just say, hey, team A, 1 point, 1 point. And they just keep talking. Continue on with the lesson. Someone blurts out from their team B, that's a point. And at the end of the lesson, whoever has the fewest number of points wins. Or if they both stay under a predetermined limit of disruptions, both teams can win. And so it just basically fosters a little bit of healthy competition between two groups of students. It sounds ridiculously simple. And spoiler alert, it is. It's the thing that and the thing that's remarkable about the good behavior game, Adam, is that this has been replicated so many times it's not funny. The good behavior game research, if you go on Google Scholar and type in the good behavior game, you're going to get dozens and dozens and dozens of hits. This has been the first good behavior game study was published in 1968 by Barish and Saunders, and they did it at a Native American reservation. And check this out: the reward was leaving school like 20 minutes early. So they had like a giant. Like if I was and they did it like a 5th or 6th grade class. If I was that age, oh man, I'd be the best behaved kid in school. But it's been done with much smaller reinforcers as well. It's been replicated in urban settings and rural settings. It's been replicated in everywhere from preschool all the way up into college, and everywhere else in between. It is probably one of the most robustly researched behavioral interventions for classroom settings. A lot of people also will be hesitant. Well, they'll say, well, Matt, isn't that like drawing attention to problem behavior, and isn't that like stigmatizing kids, when they talk out? Or doesn't that kid get ostracized because they're scoring their team's points and things like that? Excuse me. What it turns out, they've actually done surveys, they've done social validity assessments of these games and talked to teachers and talked to students about their perceptions of playing the good behavior game. And it turns out it's wildly popular when it's played. The kids love it. When the teachers finally dial in because it takes a little bit of dialing in. It's not something that you can just read and do. I mean, that does happen, but sometimes you have to play around with what the reinforcers are and things like that. And if you have like one kid with a severe repertoire problem behavior, they might need their own individualized intervention, or maybe they just, maybe they don't play until they realize they see everyone else having fun, and then
Yeah.
And then they realize, oh, it's a lot more fun just to do that. So I might as well kind of,
Yeah. I'm really glad you brought
check-
that up, actually, because so often the criticisms I see, and I sort of scroll through LinkedIn, and there's lots of different approaches to behavior on there, and I see a lot of criticisms of all sort of group contingency, class reinforcement type systems is always, oh, it ostracizes specific pupils or it causes anxiety. So it's fantastic to hear that there's data out there that says that's not actually the case.
Yeah, I'm making a note to myself here to look up that social validity article. Yeah, so not to be, I guess, to shamelessly plug my podcast, I can send you a link to. We did a deep dive on the good behavior game with Dr. Jeannie Donaldson from Louisiana State University, and she is one of the foremost experts on it. I can send you a link to that, and we went through all that stuff in much more detail. So yeah, but yeah, I would say like what's the alternative? I guess the alternative is that the teacher runs 8 different behavior plans simultaneously because she's got a behaviorally active group. That's not feasible. That's never going to happen. So and we've got evidence that the best evidence is that when given the choice to play, lots of times the students will choose to play as to not to play, because guess what? It's fun.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely.
Students like to play games, and they like to have fun, and they like low stakes competition. And if the keys to those those experiences are is good behavior, what's not to like about that?
Yeah.
So that would be my response.
And I suppose there's no less anxiety or being ostracized than there is in playing any team sport, really, because in a team sport you're reliant on your teammates to play the game well. And I like that. That's good.
Yeah. And also, if you can bring down the level of problem behavior in a classroom, that will be that has probably a greater chance if there's some sort of a baseline level of unease or anxiety in the classroom. Do you think having problem behavior in the classroom is going to help or hurt that?
Yeah.
So there's innumerable ways to I guess poke holes in that type of I guess objection to these sorts of things. So anyway, I could talk about the stuff as you can see ad nauseum here, but there's a lot of things to do. But those would be my top takeaways, I suppose, for from a classroom management perspective. Is again, look at your routines, look at how you're instructing. Don't sleep on the academic skill deficits like we talked about earlier, and then use something like a whole group contingency. Or a group contingency, like the good behavior game. It's not a whole group. It's an interdependent. I always confuse the inter and interdependent. I think it's an interdependent group contingency. I don't know.
Yeah,
someone will email me to correct me, telling me I got it wrong.
It's been a while since I've used that terminology.
Gotta dust off the whiteboard.
Intra, right? Or inter. Yeah. That's great. I like the fact that we came back there to fluency as well, because there was sort of fluency in terms of the routines is almost like fluency in just the learning skills themselves. And I find that with a lot of our pupils, some of whom maybe one day might be able to access more of a mainstream school where we're using things like the VB map, that's exactly what you're teaching, is fluency on learning skills. And what you're talking about there is teaching a whole class fluency on learning skills and of course you need that before you can learn. So that makes total sense. Yeah.
And that fluency-based instruction can be used with your more severely affected learners with autism. One of the things that, I don't work a lot with that population these days. I used to do a lot of work in that realm, but I don't, I don't maintain a binder of VB map skills for any of my, cases or anything like that. That's, but if I did, I would not necessarily do, right now, there's that whole, we have this thing where like, well, each program we do how many times? 10 trials,
Yeah.
right?
Yes. Yeah.
And that's arbitrary as you can get, right? And if I was doing that work these days, I would probably not do 10 trials. I would try to figure out like, okay, how many match to samples can I get within a 30-second timing? And what I would do is I would do the match to sample activity myself and time myself or time some other, competent learner to get a goal, if you will.
I like that sort
and then
of
use
like
that
a,
as and,
yeah.
and then use that as your kind of North Star, your aim, right? And then your goal is not, how many percent correct, irrespective of time. Your goal is like how many correct, can you get 30 matches in 30 seconds, 30 correct matches in 30 seconds or something like that. I'm making these numbers up in real time here, so that could be wildly inappropriate for that. But that's how I would go about that. I would probably do my traditional kind of ABA instruction. I would probably set the learning. I would set the lessons up in that way, most likely.
That's interesting. I like that. I'm going to be having some meetings tomorrow morning with colleagues. I had one more question, if that's okay, Matt.
I've got plenty of time.
Yeah, lovely.
Sure.
So I've done a couple of episodes where I've tried to sort of get into the basic functions of behavior, and I've talked about, if you're going to set up an intervention for a specific pupil, then you need to have a good idea of what that function is. Because if you're, for example, when I was at school, I was what we call in the UK a pain in the ass, and I used to get sent out of the class a lot, as particularly in my German lessons. And I hated my German teacher. I hated the work. So she sent me out, and then I'd make faces at my friends through the window. So I got a whole bunch of social attention. So what she thought was punishment was reinforcement. So we've sort of talked about that, and I find what I'm finding most difficult is explaining to people how they can find that out, because they're obviously not going to do a full functional analysis. And we've talked briefly, I think in a couple of episodes time, I will have talked about ABC sheets. Sure. But what would be your advice to teachers without a behavior analytic background in finding that function, or an idea of that function? Or functions, I should say now.
Yeah. I guess, so I collect a lot less ABC data than I did historically these days. One of the things, and I'm less and less of a fan of those kind of structured indirect assessments, like the MAS and the FAST and things like that. And for people who aren't behavior analysts, those are just kind of like Likert scale type forms where you're checking boxes, and it's almost formulaic. And to me, those don't really yield as detailed enough information for me to draw any specific conclusions. So I would not recommend something like that. What I recommend is so about I want to say about 10 or 15 years ago, Dr. Greg Hanley here in the States started putting together we call an open-ended functional assessment interview form. And if you just Google Greg Hanley open-ended interview, you'll get a gazillion hits on it. It's been translated into a bunch of different languages. So if you're not a native English speaker, you're very likely to find one in your language. To a certain extent. And so what that does is it just basically walks the interviewer and interviewee through a conversation about the student and the circumstances under which the behavior does and doesn't occur. And I find that really, really helpful. And so basically it's like, tell me a little bit about, it starts with, it's if you look at the form itself, there's some questions that speak to functionally assessing students with kind of more severe developmental disabilities. And like there's some questions say like, do you think this is sensory motivated or something like that? That may be buggering the actual language, the actual language of it. There's a question to that effect. And if it's a student who I don't even bother to ask that question if it's a student that I don't suspect that has those needs. That's a very specific. There's a specific purpose behind that. There's also questions about like how they communicate, and so that might be more helpful again for a more significantly developmentally delayed population. But the rest of the questions are perfectly appropriate for all sorts of kids, and basically walks the respondent through. It basically helps people think through, what happens before a problem behavior. Are there a whole host of problem behaviors? Do they occur all together, like in a snowball, or like, we might say a chain, to use the jargon, but like I usually, talking to a layperson, will say, does one lead to another, which leads to another? So if I'm working with a team with a kid who has these gigantic, aggressive events, is that preceded by some form of refusal? And something like, and if you address the refusal, does everything else go away? So it kind of prompts for questions like that. And the more and more you use that sort of thing, the more and more you'll know what follow-up questions to ask that may not necessarily be on that form. So ask questions like, well, what happens after? What do you do to calm the individual down? Is there anything you could say or do that would stop the problem behavior in its tracks? And I think once you start asking people those questions, what is second nature for behavior analysts, honestly, is not necessarily the same for people, who aren't trained like we are, which is totally fine and totally expected. There are some people who come to it naturally, but but prompting people to answer some of these questions and not necessarily fill out like a bubble sheet with a Likert scale, but actually have a conversation about problem behavior. And a lot of times when the respondent is relaying the details of a particular behavioral incident, you'll learn a lot yourself. But in the course of their telling that story, oftentimes they'll make some of those, they'll make some of those connections on their own. Oh, as they're saying, like, oh my gosh, well, I suppose now that I think about it, when X happens, I guess Y is the result. And yes, and so it's like these little things that make being a behavior analyst so much fun. Is we see other people really get into it and start being their own detective, because it very much is like detective work. Yeah, and like I said, some people are arrive at that more easily than others based on who knows what. But so I don't have a surefire answer, but I think walking people through some of those scenarios, there's and maybe trying to do some reflective listening, because if you're developing some sort of hypothesis in your head about what's going on, and you could say, hang on a second, I want to paraphrase what I thought I just heard, just to make sure I understand it correctly. So what you're saying, if I'm hearing you correctly, is when you send Adam out of class, a few minutes later, he's making faces in the window, and you've got other kids in the class who are now starting to be, so doing that kind of, paraphrasing and other types of reflective listening strategies. If you Google reflective listening, there's a lot of stuff on that. That's also helpful. A lot of stuff comes out of actually the counseling world, so that helps other people. That I often find that those types of strategies help people become better observers of their own situations.
Yeah, definitely. I like that. I really, without going into details, but I may have to ask you some more questions in a minute about Mr. Handley's work, because we're working on PFA here at the moment,
nice.
and we're trying it with our first couple of pupils. So I'll ask you a couple of questions off air, so to speak, about that one. But it's nice to hear that, like the usage of that sort of the initial step of that being used in those environments. That's really exciting. Mm-hmm. And it blows my episode about ABC data out the water. It's so much more functional than that. I mean, there's a place for ABC data, but I think it's more to confirm what you're getting out of that interview than it is necessarily to find out the actual function.
Yeah,
if that makes sense.
I couldn't agree more. I think that's an excellent point, Adam. And when I do use ABC data, it's usually when I don't know what's going on. And I don't have the opportunity to observe, and if I'm not getting good information from the interview,
Yeah.
And so the ABC data could serve as prompts to ask better questions for down the road. Oh, I see this here. I'm not really. Tell me about this event. Usually, one last thing in this, and I'll give it a rest. But one last is it, again, if you ask someone to recount. If you say something like if you're working with a kid who has like epic meltdowns, very likely if you just say, hey, can you tell me about the last time this thing happened? And I want you to start from the very beginning, before you even knew there was a problem. And let's start from there, and you prompt them to tell the entire story all the way through until the behavioral event was resolved, or the student calmed down, or whatever. That story will contain all the ABCs you likely need. I would say all, but very likely. Assuming that story is representative of the phenomenon in general, and not like a not like a one-off, if you will. You'll probably get a really, really good understanding of the problem with that particular story if you can ask the right questions, and if you can really listen well enough.
And I think that process is nice, because you don't necessarily need a behavior analyst in the room there. That could just be a teacher and a colleague having that conversation, or a teacher and a TA, or someone. As long as there's someone reflecting on what someone else is saying, you can get to that same place. As long as someone can think.
Yeah, to your point, one of the things that, and I don't want to put words in Greg's mouth, but I was having a conversation with him, and I can't remember if we had it on the air or off. But with some of their training, sometimes they actually prefer to work with people who aren't behavior analysts. When I say they, I mean Greg and his colleagues. He has a company that does consulting all over literally all over the world, because they don't bring the ABC baggage that you and I might.
Yes, yes, absolutely.
They're just telling the story of the last time someone had a meltdown or something like that, and they're not encumbered by simultaneously trying to put the story in some sort of contextual or some sort of functional box.
Yeah.
Is this attention, or is this escape, or is this some sort of combination of thereof, blah, blah, blah. So, yeah, pretty interesting.
Definitely. Well, I'm going to stop us there, Matt, although I am going to hopefully pick your brains for a couple of minutes afterwards. Thank you ever so much for coming on the show. I think there's been a huge amount of really useful stuff there, and I'll put the articles that you talked about and a link to your show as well in the show notes of this one, so that people can come over and have a listen. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, and best of luck with your podcast.
Thank you, Matt.
Thank you for listening to the Classroom Behaviour Solutions podcast. To make sure you don't miss future episodes, click the subscribe button and share this podcast with others. The more people that listen, the more help I can provide. To learn more and to find our social media pages, visit www.classroombehaviorsolutions.com. See you next time on the Classroom Behaviour Solutions podcast. Thank you.